So Greg, was there writing on the wall?
Absolutely. There has been writing on the wall for some time. It's been ignored or dismissed, and now we're seeing the results.
Let's do it on the Public Diplomat. All right, so Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine and everybody in the West is like, oh my God, how did this ever happen? You say the writing was on the wall. Talk to me about it.
Well, I mean, the writing on the wall has been there since the very end of the Cold War, and it's been gradually building up. Russia and Russians tend to have a long memory and tend to remember things. And if we remember back to the reunification of Germany, there was the promise not to move NATO 1 inch eastward. And this was confirmed by Jack Matlock, the US ambassador to the Soviet Union. You've had different periodic things. 1997, the open letter by a number of high-ranking US policy officials. If we continue to expand NATO eastward, we will have problems with Russia in the future. And then we can go forward from that, and we see the color revolutions of 2005, 4-5 in Ukraine. We see these different events, then 2014. And this has been building and building. And of course, 2014 is the watershed when it comes to Ukraine, because this is when you had Russia annex Crimea and get more deeply involved. So it was coming, but yeah, not everyone was ready.
All right. So Greg Simons from Uppsala University in Sweden. I've been reading your research on Russia's public diplomacy, Russia's communication strategy for over a decade now, and I want to bring you in to talk to our audiences about your research and what it can inform us about Putin and what is in his mind, right? Getting into the mind of Putin. So let's talk about Russia's communication strategy post-Cold War. Take us through it.
Immediately after the Cold War?
No, just for the next 2 decades.
No, but if we're to be generous,
yes.
It was chaotic and more or less non-existent, because you had the remnants of a superstate, which was something else, and it didn't know its place. It was very dependent on the West at that stage, especially the US. It was trying to be more like this Western world, and yeah, they were not in a position to assert themselves. They didn't have the economic circumstances. They were in a great state of disarray. So that was at that stage. And I mean, you've had a gradual disillusion setting in, which has taken time, but we see the results of this disillusionment.
All right, so Vladimir Putin takes power, and along the years, he brings Russian confidence back, and he starts investing money not only in his military and to upgrade it, but also in his communication infrastructure. So let's talk about the communication infrastructure that was established during the Putin years, right? From Russia Today, RT, that everybody's more aware of, along with other communication strategies.
I think it's important to realize that when Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, he was not against the West. He was actually a Westernizer, and so was very much trying to align with the West. Because if we remember back those days when George Bush was seeing wonderful things in Putin's eyes, I mean, at this stage, Russia was joining the WTO, World Trade Organization. Russia was joining what became G8, which is now back to G7. So the efforts at that stage of the communication were joining the West. It was not divorcing from the West, because you had these different relationships there. I mean, it was following Yeltsin's path. I mean, this was in spite of the Kosovo War, because that created some frictions, but it did not end this aligning with the West. I mean, what we see now is the result of the gradual realization that Russia was, from the Russian perspective, not being taken as a partner and not being taken as an equal, but as a more of an object than a subject. And so therefore you had this pushback.
All right, that's all good, but go back to my question: communication strategy, communication infrastructure.
So the communication strategy, I mean, if we look at it, was the main concern, and this was expressed early on in this kind of information security approach which they took. And Russia realized that the world was talking about Russia in different ways, but Russia was not able to get its message across to the world. So therefore, I mean, you had this information security doctrine, which came out in 2001, but it was, of course, discussed before this. And so the basic premises of the beginning of the current strategy, which we see today, was that Russia needs to be able to project its image and messages, its strategic communications to the outside world. So therefore, they needed to create a kind of BBC, Deutsche Welle, France 24 kind of enterprise. And of course, the first language of choice was English. And if we look at it since then, those Russian public diplomacy assets in terms of media communication, I mean, they've diversified into different languages depending on the different geopolitical and regional priorities of the Russian state in terms of its diplomacy. So, I mean, it's branched into Arabic, Spanish, and so forth. And its basic message to the world is that Russia has something to offer, that Russia is back in the world after its rather spectacular collapse and implosion. So therefore, it was trying to re-establish itself, and it prioritized different regions. Some regions were ignored more, but the beginnings of it. But
Greg, let's talk about that, because I think in a way Russia's communication strategy almost informs its geopolitical strategy, right? So for those who were so surprised by Russia's move away from the West and towards other places, was the writing on the wall. So let's talk about, you said initially it was mostly in English, targeted at the West, at Europe, at the United States, but now we have Russia today in Arabic, in different parts of the world, pivoting towards Asia in their own sense, and towards Africa and towards the Middle East. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one indicator of those changing geopolitical priorities. And for example, when the world seemed surprised when Russia was back in the Middle East, but this should not have been a surprise. I mean, the fact that Russian public diplomacy media assets such as RT and others started publishing and broadcasting in Arabic, this should have been like a big indicator. Hello, I mean, this is a priority, and it was a fairly early priority. If I remember rightly, that was back in 2005 that they started doing it. So, I mean, this is only 5 years after Putin came to power as president. So, I mean, it's sending a clear signal that it is moving elsewhere. And I mean, if we look at that in conjunction with how these foreign policy concepts of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, how they're worded, I mean, if you bring these two things together, I mean, the path is very clear that it was moving away from this Western-centric world where it felt as though it was an object of the game, to moving towards this non-Western-centric world where it felt it was being a subject in things, and one of the leading parts of it.
So let's talk about their communication strategy and their positioning specifically, right? In a communication sense. So if they're moving away from Europe and saying, "Hey, Europe, we share your values. We're committed to democracy. We want to be one of you," and now there is a new message. It's a message of leadership and strength. Can you talk about the notion of power, strength, and leadership in the world in the Russian psyche, if there is such a thing?
Well, I mean, it's clear in the messaging what's going on. I mean, just look at the slogans, for example, used by RT, question more. So, I mean, this is indicating what the position is. What are they questioning more? They're questioning the Western narrative, and mainly, especially this US-driven narrative of the world. And I mean, one can see that they position themselves as a challenger to what the US is doing in the world, and they position what the US-led world is doing as being destructive and disruptive to international relations, as well as regional security and so forth. And I mean, there's been a definite development because it's gone from countering these projected disruptions and subversions and so forth. And if we look at what's happening now, it's moved beyond that, because it's going to a more of an idea that they're leading something. So this is not something countering something, but building something more. And I mean, if we look, I mean, you see Lavrov currently where he is in the Middle East and Africa. I mean, this is quite indicative of that. And I mean, if looking elsewhere, I mean, there's this expansion of BRICS, for example, this kind of competing form to European Union, or this idea of these Western-led trade blocs, and this is expanding and expanding. So, I mean, these are clear indicators where this is going. This is the strategy, and this is the placement where they put Russia in these changes, this idea. And because if we look at the whole strategic picture, how it's characterized, I mean, this is based on the perception that you've got a declining Western-centric US unipolar world order and moving towards this non-Western-centric multipolar order.
Absolutely. I mean, which was kind of it's where it all started. I mean, before the end of the Cold War, there were alternatives. It wasn't just the US and the West. And then after the Cold War, Europe, the United States, they provided the leadership, globalization, opening of markets, and everything is feeding into the Western perspective. Now the West is seen as on the decline after Afghanistan and Iraq, and the lack of willingness from all US administrations and European administrations to get involved in the world. And Russia's message is very clear. If you're not going to be involved, we're going to provide the leadership. And we saw that in Syria, and we're seeing that in many parts of the world these days. So the communication strategy, the writing was on the wall all along. Greg, well, you were talking about Deutsche Welle and Voice of America and the BBC. Many have argued that in today's world, and when you think about power, everybody's always thinking about hard power and soft power, but communication power, right? The ability to frame the world, build the media agenda and influence global public opinion is a part of a nation's overall power, right? So, I mean, how does Russia stack up against the Al Jazeera's, against the European government-sponsored channels, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Americans? How do you think in terms of budgets and in terms of overall market penetrations in different parts of the world? Where would you rate the Russian effort?
Well, I mean, like all of those other ones, I mean, these international media that is associated with public diplomacy, I mean, it's not their intention to interpret the world. I mean, it's the intention to represent geopolitics rather than interpret it. So, I mean, like this, everyone has something in common in terms of the baseline from which they're working. And if we look at those Western-centric worlds, of course, this doesn't fly because the information environment is deeply hostile to Russia and to Russian interests in terms of the mainstream media. But then if you start digging down beyond mainstream media, this is when you actually see that there are little individuals and groups which more subscribe to the messages from these channels like RT, Sputnik, and so forth. Because
actually, Greg, can I put my finger on this? And this is a really interesting topic. You look at public opinion poll from Europe, and you're seeing that in the European right, I mean, this is in Italy and even in where you are in Swedish Democrats, right? We see that the Russian narrative, in a way, is gathering traction amongst some of the more right-wing political parties in Europe. How is that? Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's like the US and other places because, I mean, I for want of a better term, but I think it's quite appropriate. I mean, these conservative groups, socially and culturally conservative groups in the Western world, feel as though that there is a culture war with the liberals, and so they seek to align or communicate with more culturally and socially conservative forces. I mean, Israel is another in terms of this, where people from the right, which traditionally have not always been very favorable, but now with this idea of culture war, they feel much greater affinity to those who stand up for traditional family values, these kinds of central values to conservative beliefs. And I mean, you can definitely see that with these some elements of neo-conservatives in the States, with Dreyer and these kinds of figures, I mean, who are referring to Russia as being, well, before this, bearing in mind that this was before the current war, we're referring to Russia as an upholder of Western values rather than one that is dragging down or dismembering Western values. They see the liberals as being the enemy of their system of values and lifestyle.
I want to give an alternative explanation. I disagree with you. I'm going to argue that you're partially right in my view. I think that a lot of people on the right, you are correct, they have a suspicion, and their suspicion is towards big government, right? And centralized government. And what I think in Europe, this is my interpretation, I would love to get your feedback on this. The concern is over Brussels and the fact that the people in Brussels, who are now really elected by the people of Italy and Sweden, right, and in Spain and France, these are a bunch of bureaucrats that are disconnected from the world and from everyday lives of European people and European nations, and the values that they're promoting in Brussels are not consistent with the values of the everyday European, right? So the attempt by Putin to undermine the bureaucracy in Brussels is what is so appealing to many people on the right. What do you think about that?
Well, if you're talking about Europe, yeah, I mean, this is partly to do with it, because now, I mean, you've got this alternative brand of the European Union as the EU SSR. So you've got this kind of attempt to manage its reputation as being something linked to the Soviet Union, that is this rather obscene bureaucratic body which is devoid of this kind of human feeling. And yeah, I mean, they are very separated from the reality of life for average citizens. And I mean, this gets demonstrated regularly. And of course, it alienates people from the system. And of course, this takes away this sense of belonging and purpose. So then there is an attempt. What do you do if you lack a sense of purpose and belonging? You go to look for it elsewhere. And I mean, we're not only talking about Russia, one can also mention ISIS, for example, which was offering recruits this sense of identity and purpose and belonging in life, which many bought, even though they had all the basic physical needs met. They did not have the psychological needs met.
Well, this is interesting stuff. I love it. And in a way, the Russian involvement in European politics, is there an a strategic communication campaign to undermine the European Union and to help, Marine Le Pen in France, or, the right wing in upcoming Italian elections, or the Dutch right? I mean, we see that Russia is involved in terms of not only financial support, but also messaging, and trying to build up those political parties. Is Russia trying to undermine the EU through communications?
Well, the best ones to undermine the EU are the EU themselves. They have little competition in this regard. I mean, what they have done in this regard, and this also refers to these country bodies as well, because this fight against populism and so forth, which Le Pen and all of these other different more right-wing conservative movements which are growing. Well, one of the things they do is they try to shut them off from any funding, which all political parties need or movements need in order to grow, to sustain themselves. And I mean, this leaves an opening. If you cut it out from access to funds from within the EU, that leaves external players to fill the gap, because you create a vacuum, but it's the law of physics. A vacuum will not remain a vacuum forever. So you create an own vulnerability by doing so.
It's really interesting. So you're saying wherever there's a vacuum, right, left by the West, the Russians are going to step in, whether it's in Syria, right, as an example, or in European politics.
No, absolutely. It makes perfect sense too. I mean, if you're creating these vulnerabilities at the same time, you're building conflict with Russia. I mean, it's going to be common sense for Russia to exploit those vulnerabilities.
So without bringing a moral evaluation in here, is Vladimir Putin a brilliant geostrategist, or is he a madman?
He's not a madman. I mean, this is clear. I mean, a madman doesn't make the decisions that he has done. Otherwise, Russia would have been finished some time ago. And the fact that he's been 22 years, well, 20 years in power, I mean, at the top, that is more than a madman. It's someone who knows how to play these political and geopolitical games. And yeah, I mean, he set the course. I mean, he has been setting forth the idea to resurrect Russia as an international power. And in this respect, I mean, he's been able to systematically do so, not only in terms of his own strengths and opportunities, but also from these weaknesses which have been exposed by the West in its, I mean, at times seemingly suicidal, or should we say at least ill-advised policy paths that it's been taking.
And he's got the support of the Russian people for now. So the Russian people are behind him, according to public opinion polls, supporting the war in Ukraine, despite the fact that in the West, we represent it as highly unpopular, right? I mean, a lot of Western media were talking about a possible coup, the fall of Vladimir Putin, and that is not happening right now. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Great topic. We're going to find out what happens with Vladimir Putin and with Russia. Will Russia be embraced back into the arms of the Western community, or is it going to reemerge as a geopolitical rival for many years to come? Greg, thank you so much for coming in. And for everybody, thank you for listening and watching The Public Diplomat. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.